14, which is continuing the cardiovascular system, but this time we're going to talk about blood pressure, really. Blood pressure, which is blood flowing through your arteries and veins in that closed circulatory system. And we're splitting it up into two parts. So this is part one. All right. So, like I said, there's a pressure gradient. That pressure gradient is your blood pressure. Your blood pressure is a pressure gradient. Why? Because you have a heart, and that heart is a muscular pump. And what does it pump? It pumps blood. So it's going to pump blood out of the heart, and it's either going to go to the lungs and back to the heart, or it's going to pump blood and it's going to go to all cells of the body and then back to heart. So really there's two closed circuits, two closed individual circuits. One, it's really the right side of the heart pumping blood to the lungs and back. That is the pulmonary circuit. And then you have the systemic circuit, which is all the cells of the body and pumping it back. And in order, the heart is the complete engine or strength of pushing that blood through the system, through these vessels, and having that blood have enough pressure created by the heart to get the blood all the way back to the heart. Now, in the pulmonary circuit, it can be a very low pressure because it doesn't have far to go, right? The lungs are right next to the heart. So the heart pumps blood from the right side to the lungs and then back next door to the heart. So it can be a low pressure system, not a big deal. But systemic system has to be a higher pressure system because it has to go all the way from the heart to legs, toes, back up to heart, or to head and arms and back to heart. And so you have to pump with enough pressure to be able to get that blood all the way down to your toes and back up to your heart. And so that pressure we rely on, we call it blood pressure. It's actually termed mean arterial pressure. And we'll get to that. Now, there's going to be resistance to blood flowing, to blood going from heart to toes everywhere. Not just toes, but literally it has to go everywhere. And then back to the heart, right? There's resistance in the system because the artery diameter can change. There can be more plaque on the inside of the artery wall, which can decrease the diameter or decrease its ability to expand and contract. All of these things are resistance against flow. Resistance against blood flow from heart and back to heart. And we'll talk about the resistance. And so first we're going to talk about flow, we're going to talk about resistance, and then we get into more the intricacies of blood flow. And I don't know why it's not letting me move this. There we go. All right. So let's start with terms. Definition of blood flow. Need to know this. That's enough. Definition. know this. Hey, I'll highlight it for you. It is a volume of blood flowing through a vessel in a given period of time. So really, it's a volume of blood flowing in a given period of time. And so the volume part is here, and the period of time is here. So it's volume per minute. And per really means divided by. So you see milliliters per minute. That is blood flow. You may remember this from chapter 13, but another name for blood flow is written right here, cardiac output. Cardiac output is da-da-da, blood flow. And so, again, cardiac output is the volume of blood being pumped through our circulatory system in 1 minute. Now, at rest, it remains relatively constant. Average is 5 liters per minute, which another way to say that is 5,000 milliliters per minute. That's the average amount of cardiac output or blood flow. Everybody needs this. Everybody needs this amount of blood circulating just for oxygen delivery purposes, so cellular respiration can continue. When individual starts exercising, the oxygen needs are going to increase, and therefore cardiac output has to increase, or another way to say it is blood flow increases. So it can vary widely depending on blood flow needs, meaning are you exercising and what is the intensity of exercise? And your body will increase or decrease blood flow accordingly. So that's blood flow. Blood pressure is not a flow, it's a force. It's a force per unit area exerted on the walls of the blood vessel by the blood. It's a pressure. It is expressed in millimeters of mercury. That's a force. So it's really a measurement of the force or pressure of the blood in your systemic circuit pushing on the arterial walls. That is your mean arterial pressure. You can have pulmonary pressure that is in your pulmonary circuit, and they are somewhat separated because the pulmonary circuit is somewhat separated from the arterial circuit, although since it's one heart pumping blood to two circuits, if you have extreme high blood pressure, that will back up the right side or the pulmonary circuit and can cause pulmonary pressure. So they are kind of independent, but they're kind of not independent. We are mainly focusing on arterial blood pressure or mean arterial pressure. That is what we measure in a clinic or hospital when we're measuring blood pressure. We're not measuring the pulmonary circuit's pressure with a blood pressure cuff. We're only measuring the arterial pressure. But remember, it can have an effect on the pulmonary pressure. So pressure gradients drive this pressure. And so we are going to talk about pressure gradients. Pressure gradients are the difference in the highest pressure minus the lowest pressure. That's a pressure gradient. It's going from the highest to the lowest. And so pressure gradients matter. The other thing that affects blood pressure is, again, resistance. resistance to blood flowing through the arterial circuit. So we call that total peripheral resistance. And your blood pressure or mean arterial pressure is really the product or multiplication, which another way to say multiplication is product. Product means multiplication in math. So mean arterial pressure, blood pressure, is the product of cardiac output times resistance. And that is important too, because resistance moment to moment will control blood pressure moment to moment. So let's start with flow. The circulatory system is a closed system, remember. Blood pressure gets created by the heart, and the blood is circulating in arteries, which branch and get smaller to arterioles, which branch and get smaller to capillaries, which this is where blood and the interstitial fluid exchanges. And then there's merging. So on this end, there's branching, and there's branching all the way till you get to the capillary beds, and then these vessels will start to merge, and we just start calling them veins because the definition of a vein is a vessel that was returning blood back to the heart. And these veins then return the blood to the heart. So this is the closed system. Pressure, again, is the force measured in millimeters of mercury exerted by the blood on the arterial walls. We are measuring this pressure difference from the high pressure to the low pressure. So this is what we would call delta P. Delta stands for difference. Difference in pressure. And so it's always going to be the high pressure minus the lowest pressure. So pressure is the force pushing blood against various factors that resist that blood from flowing forward. And if we look at this example here, blood is flowing from A to B. So this is A, that's B, and blood is flowing from A to B until, you guessed it, they are equal on both sides. And then it stops flowing. So if we have 100 millimeters of mercury pressure in A, that pressure is going to drive the liquid to flow into the lesser pressure because liquid is exerting pressure on the wall of the container, and it will flow from 100 into the lesser pressure until they're equal on both sides, which is going to be when it stops. And so in this example, there's 60 millimeters of mercury pressure in B. It's going to be a 40 millimeter mercury pressure difference. Between the high pressure, which is 100 millimeters of mercury, and the low pressure in the other side, because fluid's allowed to move, and that low pressure is 60. And so the difference is going to be 100 minus 60, which is the pressure difference. And we just use the symbol delta for pressure difference. Delta means difference in P, pressure. So blood flow is delta P, or the pressure difference between high and low, divided by the resistance to this blood flowing through the closed circuit. Let's explore this. Pressure gradients drive from a high pressure to low pressure. Everything in that liquid's going to flow. We call it bulk flow. That's where just everything is moving in the blood. What creates this pressure gradient is your heart. Your heart is a muscular pump that creates the pressure gradient. That's why in heart failure, the heart is not creating enough pressure to get the blood from the left ventricle back to the right atria. It's failing to create enough pressure. So heart failure is when the heart fails to create enough pressure through contracting that blood does not adequately make it all the way back to the heart. And if blood doesn't make it all the way back to the heart, that decreases venous return. And if you have a decrease in venous return, you have a decrease in end diastolic volume, which means you're going to end up with a decrease in stroke volume, which means you have to try to increase your heart rate to keep cardiac output at around 5 liters per minute, which is what we need. So that becomes a problem, right? It's your heart can only beat so many times. And if you're not getting enough venous return, your stroke volume is going to go down and heart rate might not be able to make up the difference. And so that's when we start calling someone's in heart failure. Bottom line is a gradient must exist throughout the circulatory system to maintain blood flow. That's why low blood pressure becomes a problem. It's not enough pressure to get the blood from the left ventricle all the way back to the right atrium. Now, under normal conditions, the pressure of the blood in the aorta, where it just is pumped from the left ventricle to the aorta is the large artery that receives the blood directly from the left ventricle. The pressure is 85 millimeters of mercury. So this is our high. By the time it makes it back to the vena cava, which is our main veins returning the blood back to the heart, it has a pressure of just about 0. So this is the low. So when we look at the pressure or delta P, normal delta P, it's going to be 85 millimeters of mercury, which is our high, minus 0 millimeters of mercury, which is our low, which makes delta P 85 millimeters of mercury in the systemic circuit, not in the pulmonary circuit. The pulmonary circuit is going to have its own pressure difference. So the pressure gradient across the pulmonary circuit, like I said, is different. The heart doesn't need to make a huge pressure gradient for the blood to go from the right ventricle to the lungs and then back to the left atria. And so we find that the delta P is 15 millimeters of mercury of pressure. So That versus 85 millimeters of mercury pressure is reflected in the myocardium. So the muscle on the left side, left ventricle wall, is much thicker because there needs to be more muscle to create this bigger pressure gradient, 85 millimeters mercury pressure. The right ventricle can be really thin, doesn't need a lot of muscle to create 15 millimeters of mercury pressure. And this average pressure here that is being shown right here, if we look at this, the systemic circuit with the big arteries has this 85 millimeters of mercury, but with every branching off of these arteries to go to different areas, the pressure is going to drop because one artery splits into two, and then those two split into four, and so forth, because it has to be distributed through the whole body. So the pressure is really dropping in the arterioles because this is where the major branching is and sending this blood to all areas of the body. And so we see the biggest drop here in the arterioles. By the time you hit the veins, the systemic circuit and pulmonary circuit are both coming in and around zero. So resistance in the cardiovascular system is anything that is fighting against the pressure gradient, making it harder for the blood to circulate from a ventricle back to an atria. And so this pressure gradient has to be way higher in the systemic circuit because there's a lot more to fight in terms of resistance. There's just a lot more areas of the body. It also has to fight gravity to come back up to the heart if someone's standing up. And so this pressure gradient has to be a lot bigger. But there's one heart pumping blood to two places. Really more than two places, but for simplification, it's pumping it to the lungs and to all cells of the body. So this is systemic and this is pulmonary. Blood flow has to be the same. That is to say, the rate, not pressure, but rate of flow has to be equal because there's one pump. You can't have one flow going twice as fast as the other. You only have one heart. It has to fill with blood at the same time. You have to pump blood out at the same time. And one's a low pressure system and the other's a high pressure system. So what do you do to keep the flow rate the same? Well, you play with resistance. Your heart plays with resistance. So if flow is X and you have a high pressure and you divide it by resistance versus flow has to be X again, it has to be the same between the pulmonary blood flow and the systemic blood flow, but we're looking at a much lower pressure than the systemic circuit. So how do we keep the rate the same? Think about it. Well, if you increase resistance and this number gets bigger, what happens to the number it's dividing into? It's actually going to go down. And so if resistance is high, then flow is going to decrease because you are dividing into it. It would be 85 divided by R. So when R goes up, it's gonna make 85 less because you're dividing more into 85, and that less means it's slowing down the flow versus if you have a lower resistance, that's going to then increase flow because 15 divided by R, if you decrease this, it's going to increase or keep it similar. And so that's how we even out flow by resistance. So what I'm trying to tell you is the pulmonary circuit has much lower resistance to flow than the systemic circuit. And so they end up being equal speeds because of that. So how does that how is that affected? Well, we can control resistance by controlling the radius or diameter of the blood vessels. That's one way. And so you see this in the systemic circuit. If you decrease the radius, that is going to increase the resistance. And if you decrease radius and increase resistance, well, remember, blood flow is pressure divided by resistance. And if you increase this resistance, pressure stays the same. You're not changing the pressure. It's going to decrease blood flow. And that's how, minute to minute, your autonomic nervous system can decrease blood flow. It just decreases the radius, which makes it a smaller tube, which slows down blood flow. That's how our faucets work in our house. When you turn the faucet, you are opening up the diameter of the pipe so water can start to flow through it. If you just turn it a teeny bit, you're opening up the radius a teeny bit and you get a little bit of blood flow. If you really crank it and you really open the radius of that pipe, then you get a lot of water flowing through that. And so that is an example of vasodilation. You're increasing the radius or diameter of the artery. That is going to result in a complete decrease in resistance because now there's a bunch of space for blood to move, and that will increase blood flow. So vasoconstriction decreases the radius or the diameter of the tube. And so when you have a smaller tube diameter, less fluid could go through that tube. So that is another way of saying it decreases blood flow. And on the opposite end, if you vasodilate, you are dilating or increasing the radius, which decreases the resistance because there's more space for the blood to flow, and so it's going to flow faster. Pulmonary circuit, you start off with a lower pressure gradient, right? Systemic circuit, we're 85 millimeters of mercury. Pulmonary, you're only at 15, right? And so to keep the flow rate the same, just basically have no resistance. So they even out. And so the resistance is lower and the pressure gradient is lower in the pulmonary circuit. All right, more terms. Resistance, really it's peripheral resistance. It's what the blood flow has to work against. So what blood flow driven by heart muscle, oops, driven by heart muscle has to work against. So another way to say this, it's a measure of the amount of friction the blood encounters What kind of forces does this blood have to push against to get back to the heart? So there are three things that really can affect resistance to flow, resistance to blood flowing from left ventricle to right atrium. And one of those is how thick the blood is. So viscosity is a measurement of thickness, of how thick the blood is. So if it's super thick, it's got a bunch of red blood cells or proteins or triglycerides and fats in there. It's gonna be sticky and slower to move. It's the equivalent of trying to get ketchup out of a ketchup bottle versus olive oil out of an olive oil bottle. Olive oil is less viscous. It's gonna go faster out of that bottle than ketchup would, more viscous. Second thing is total blood vessel length. Well, babies have lower blood pressure because they have shorter vessels in length. But as they grow, their blood pressure increases, normal blood pressure, because their blood vessel length increases. Here's the thing, this doesn't change after someone's finished growing. The thing and I should say, blood viscosity only changes when there's something wrong, when there is pathology, or someone hemorrhages, or someone's severely dehydrated. They lose too much fluid and it makes it really thick because it just less fluid in there. What can affect resistance moment to moment and what our blood pressure is really predicated on comes down to blood vessel diameter. So this is what really controls our resistance in the cardiovascular system. Blood vessel diameter. We can control blood vessel diameter because all blood vessels have smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle can constrict or relax. And we call that vasoconstriction or vasorelaxation. That right there, that is arteriosclerosis. When we have a decrease in blood vessel diameter because there's plaque forming on the inside wall of the artery, which makes the diameter smaller. And then you can have arterial sclerosis where uh, atherosclerosis is where the diameter gets smaller due to plaque and stuff sticking to the wall. And arteriosclerosis is where it is the quote hardening of the arteries. The arteries are no longer elastic and expandable when blood gets ejected into them, and they no longer contract back when the blood moves on, and that causes problems as well. So vasodilation is an increase in the radius, and that causes a decrease in resistance. Vasoconstriction, you're making the radius smaller, you're constricting it, and that is going to increase resistance. And again, what happens with an increase in resistance is you have delta P divided by resistance, and if this goes up and that stays the same, then blood pressure also goes up. So this is what drives moment to moment blood pressure. So this is showing you flow. So if we look at flow, if you have a diameter that is 2x versus a diameter that is just x, meaning this one's twice as big, you are going to have increase in flow. Why? Because the diameter is bigger. So like the sink faucet. This, my friends, is a blood vessel that has atherosclerosis, which is plaque. So fatty plaques from atherosclerosis, also called the in and out artery. Here we go. This is what the diameter used to be. The diameter used to be this big before in and out. I'm teasing. Not really, though. Before fatty plaque. Now, the diameter is just this. So the diameter has been drastically cut into half. What does this mean? An increase in resistance, decrease in diameter. Increased resistance, remember, mean arterial pressure or blood pressure is equal to the pressure difference divided by resistance. This right here increases resistance, automatically is going to increase blood pressure. So this is when stents are put in to kind of try to smash this plaque back up against the wall, angioplasty, to try to increase this diameter back up again. When that can't be done, say in coronary arteries that are the little arteries that are supplying blood to the heart muscle wall, then you have to do bypass. You have to bypass that severely blocked artery that has a small diameter. Total peripheral resistance is, like it says, total. So it's combining the resistance of all the blood vessels within the systemic circuit, but veins really don't contribute because the pressure is so low. So we're going to get to a place where we just call it mean arterial pressure because we're just really looking at the total peripheral resistance in the arterial system. This resistance, again, depends on diameter of the lumen. Lumen's a fancy way for inside of the tube or blood vessel. So it's the inside of the blood vessel tube. And then how thick that blood is. And remember, your blood can get thicker if you lose a bunch of fluid. Those red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, plasma proteins are going to get more concentrated and closer together. That's going to make it thicker. Under normal conditions, viscosity stays the same, but people can create too many red blood cells, and that can increase the viscousness. People can blood dope, and that can increase the viscousness. So that is a possibility, but most of the time we're just dealing with vasoconstriction, contracting smooth muscle of the arteries, or there's some kind of atherosclerosis. In any case, there's an increase in resistance due to a decrease in diameter, which is going to decrease flow. So vasoconstriction causes an increase in resistance, which slows down blood. Versus if you lower the resistance in an artery or vasodilation, you're going to increase the blood flow. This is also how we can get blood to move from our internal organs to our skin and muscles. We're going to vasoconstrict those vessels sending blood to our kidneys and digestive tract if we're exercising because we want more of our blood flow to go to the muscles and skin. So we're going to vasodilate those arteries that are sending blood to our muscles and skin. So we have higher blood flow to certain areas. and then constrict blood flow to other areas. All right. Blood flow is inversely proportional to peripheral resistance, like I said. So this is blood flow, and it's really the pressure difference divided by resistance. So again, as this number goes up, that number goes down. As this number goes down, that number goes up. They're inverse. So as resistance goes up, blood flow goes down. As resistance goes down, blood flow goes up. And resistance can be changed by altering the vessel diameter. Now we're going to put it together, right? Blood flow, as stated before, is cardiac output. P for pressure is mean arterial pressure. It is the pressure in the system between the beginning of the circuit and the end, between the aorta and the vena cava. Now, if we plug this in, right, we're starting with this. If we're exchanging cardiac output for flow, we're going to put cardiac output here. If we're exchanging pressure for mean arterial pressure, we're exchanging it here. Resistance stays the same. That is to say, cardiac output is equal to mean arterial pressure, or a lot of times we just say blood pressure, divided by resistance. Resistance in our cardiovascular system is total peripheral resistance because we have to account for all the arteries in the system and what is contributing to the total resistance. You can have some arteries that are free flowing, high diameter, and some are going to be restricted and have a lower diameter. So we have to account for all those different arteries in the systemic circuit. So we call it total peripheral resistance. And so we end up with this formula. Now, remember, mean arterial blood pressure is blood pressure, and we want to find what is blood pressure. So what do we have to do to this to get blood pressure all off on its own? What do? We multiply by total peripheral resistance. So then we can cross out total peripheral resistance, and we multiply on both sides. And now we end up with mean arterial pressure equal to total peripheral resistance times cardiac output. Or if we were looking at it based on this, we would have mean arterial pressure or blood pressure equal to cardiac output, which is flow, blood flow, times total peripheral resistance, which is just R. So blood pressure, didn't mean to do that. Mean arterial pressure or blood pressure is our total peripheral resistance times cardiac output. And here is where it is restating what I said. But remember, cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. So we could take it a step further. And instead of saying cardiac output, we could say heart rate times stroke volume times total peripheral resistance all create our blood pressure. That's why blood pressure goes up when heart rate goes up. When you're working out, you're going to have an increase in blood pressure because your heart rate's going up. And to some extent, your stroke rate volume is going up. You can keep total peripheral resistance the same or increase it a little, but your mean arterial pressure is going up. Another way also to explain mean arterial pressure is how much blood per minute, which is cardiac output right here, is being pumped against what resistance or force in the system. What is your heart? How much pressure does your heart need to create to overcome this resistance in the system. And so normal blood pressures, when the heart is contracting, it should be anywhere from 90 to 120 millimeters of mercury. Now, it can be 90 when there's no plaque on the arterial walls and the heart is extremely strong at creating a delta P. And so it doesn't have to be, you're getting a lot of blood, you have a slow heart rate, a lot of pressure, a lot of blood is returning to the heart. Let me put it to you this way. This is why healthy blood pressures are going to be less than 120 millimeters of mercury. You can have a 90 millimeter mercury pressure. Why? Because you have a really low heart rate times a normal cardiac output. Well, heart rate is part of cardiac output. Let me rephrase that. You have a low heart rate, which means you're going to end up with a really strong stroke volume. And if you multiply that by resistance, but the resistance is low because you have big, healthy artery diameters, right? Got a big diameter, so you're going to be flowing. That means that you don't have to create that much pressure because you have so much ability to flow the blood from the left ventricle to the right atria that you only need 90 millimeters of mercury of pressure to get it all the way through. But if you have a high heart rate, that could possibly decrease your stroke volume. That means and you have a high total peripheral resistance. You have atherosclerosis or arteriosclerosis. To overcome this, you really need to increase the pressure to overcome that high resistance. And you have a high heart rate because it has to compensate for the low returning of blood flow or the trouble you're having getting blood to circulate. So you end up with high blood pressure because your heart isn't in shape, it doesn't pump enough blood, and there's plaque in your artery walls. And so you end up with high blood pressure. So it's kind of a combination. Too low of a blood pressure is a problem because you're not creating enough delta P to get the blood back to the heart just under normal resistance. Other things that can influence blood pressure: as we age, our blood pressure naturally goes up. As weight increases, blood pressure goes up. Time of day tends to be the lowest in the morning and higher as the day goes on. Exercise can increase blood pressure. Body position, laying down. There's no gravity, so that's going to decrease blood pressure. Emotional state, this is, pressure is run by the autonomic nervous system, which controls vessel diameter. So you're all stressed out, it's going to constrict those vessels. It's going to increase resistance, increase total peripheral resistance. That's going to increase mean arterial pressure. Some drugs can also affect the total peripheral resistance. Histamines, allergy meds, Advil even, Sudafed, cold medications. These can all just transiently increase your blood pressure. Pulse pressure, that's the difference between the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. And this is what you feel when you feel your pulse. You're going to feel this 40 millimeters of mercury pressure difference between your contracting of the heart and pushing the blood through, and then when the heart's not contracting, just the pressure on the arterial wall. So pulse pressure is really what you feel, that increase in pressure in your vessel as you're pushing down on the vessel. And the important factors determining how big or strong that pulse pressure is stroke volume, the speed of ejection, and then can your artery expand elastically and contract back? So this is where arterial sclerosis becomes a problem. Oh, I have it written right here. Um, Arterial sclerosis is going to decrease compliance, and therefore it's not going to expand and snap back and drive the blood forward. And so that actually increases blood pressure because it's not expanding, it's staying the same diameter. So that 40 millimeters of mercury in a healthy artery expanded out while it goes through. And so there's no pressure difference when the heart's ejecting or during systole. And then it can come back when it's in diastole, but the flow stays the same. If it's not elastic like that, it becomes problematic. So compliance is a measurement of how well the vessel changes with the pulse pressure. Low compliance arteries, a small change in blood volume can cause a huge increase in pressure. And high compliance, you can have a large increase, but it's not going. It's going to kind of even out in the end because those arteries compliant. It goes along with it. It expands with the large volume change and contracts, and it doesn't mess so much with the overall pressure. So the higher the compliance of a structure, the more easily it's stretched, which means it has less effect on overall blood pressure because it's accommodating these changes in volume. Systemic blood pressure is going to be the highest in the aorta because that is receiving blood directly from the left ventricle, where the pressure is created, which is left ventricle, right? Vena cava, it's just dribbling back into the right atria. Oops, dribbling blood back to heart. And so we're going to have 0 there. And so this is kind of showing you systolic pressure is always higher because this is when the heart muscle is contracting and it's ejecting the stroke volume into arterial system. Diastolic is when the heart is relaxed and no additional blood is entering. So it's much lower. When we talk about mean arterial pressure, we're talking about the mean between systemic or systolic and diastolic pressure. So we're getting the mean between the two. You guys have to take stats so you know. And since arterials, this is where you have the most branching. This is where the mean arterial pressure really becomes the same as the systolic and diastolic pressure. And so mean arterial pressure is going to be the mean between systolic and diastolic pressure. 2 factors, the elasticity of the vessels matter and the volume being injected into the vessels matter. Systolic pressure, here are definitions. Diastolic pressure, pulse pressure, mean arterial pressure. Pulse pressure, if you want to figure out mean arterial pressure just based on diastolic, you can do diastolic pressure divided by 1/3 of pulse pressure. How do you figure that out? When you take a blood pressure reading, you get the diastolic pressure and the systolic pressure. So you have those 2 available to figure out pulse pressure. So you can figure out mean arterial pressure. Pulse pressure and mean arterial pressure both decline as they get farther away from the heart, as they increase distance from the heart. All right, I'm gonna stop here and give you a minute to then go on to part 2.